The shift took Marcus before conscious thought could intervene, his wolf surging forward as the radio crackled with desperate voices from 2nd Platoon pinned down 3 clicks east. One moment he was General Marcus Thornfield, 42 years old and decorated commander of the Northern Territories forces. The next he was muscle and fang and instinct, 400 pounds of alpha wolf exploding from human form in a transformation that never stopped being simultaneously agony and ecstasy. His uniform shredded as bone restructured and muscle mass doubled, the familiar burning sensation racing through every nerve ending, while his consciousness expanded to include pack bonds that connected him to every soldier under his command. He felt their fear through the mental link, tasted their determination, sensed the exact moment when Private Morrison took the hit that would kill him. The pack bond carried Morrison's death like a physical blow to Marcus's chest, another thread severed, another name added to the list that already numbered 127 souls. Major Ethan Cross shifted beside him without needing orders, his beta wolf slightly smaller but just as lethal, moving in perfect synchronization that came from 2 decades of combat together. Through the pack link, Marcus sent tactical instructions that required no words, just images and intentions that his wolves understood instantly. Flank left through Ashwood sector, hit the whites from the ridge, by 2nd Platoon time to extract. The other soldiers followed, a dozen wolves moving through pre-dawn darkness with coordination that should have been impossible except for the pack bonds that tied them together into single fighting unit, with Marcus as the central node controlling their movements. He could feel each of them through the connection, their individual sense marking them as pack, even when separated by distance, their emotions bleeding through into his awareness in ways that made command simultaneously easier and infinitely harder. Because when Morrison died, Marcus felt it happen, felt the terror and pain and the desperate final thought of a 19-year-old kid who had wanted so badly to make his grandfather proud. Felt the exact moment when Morrison's consciousness winked out and the pack bond dissolved into empty space where living soldier had been moments before. Marcus pushed the grief down with practice born from burying too many, focused on the tactical situation that required his full attention. The whites were visible now through wolf senses that processed the world in ways human form could never match. Scent told him they were corrupted spirits wearing flesh that had gone wrong somewhere in the transformation, wrong enough that even his wolf recoiled from the spiritual stench of them. Hearing picked up their movements through underbrush, the particular sound of something that weighed more than it should and moved with joints bending in directions nature never intended. His wolf wanted to attack, to defend pack with fang and fury, but the human consciousness that rode alongside the animal knew that would be suicide. Whites could not be killed through physical violence alone, their corrupted spiritual essence just regenerating whatever damage conventional attacks inflicted. But they could be driven back, could be forced to retreat if enough pressure was applied in the right ways. And that was what Marcus's tactical mind calculated, even as his wolf body raced toward combat. The ridge gave them advantage of high ground and overlapping fields of fire. 12 wolves spreading out in textbook formation that Marcus had drilled into them through endless training exercises. They opened fire from shifted form, a technique that required enormous control to maintain enough human cognition to operate weapons while still accessing wolf strength and senses. Most soldiers could not do it, the animal mind overwhelming human reason during shift. But Marcus's people were elite for a reason. The gunfire drove the whites' attention away from 2nd Platoon, exactly as planned. And for 4 minutes, the tactical situation developed according to Marcus's projections. 2nd Platoon extracted in good order, casualties limited to Morrison and 3 wounded who could still move under their own power. The whites turned toward Marcus's position, but slowly, almost lazily, as if they knew conventional weapons posed no real threat. Then at minute 5, everything went sideways as Specialist Davies took a hit that should not have been possible, a white breaking through their formation faster than anything that size should have moved. The creature's claws raked across Davies's flank, and Marcus felt through the pack bond the exact moment when Davies's spiritual energy began draining into the corruption, his essence being pulled into the same twisted wrongness that animated the whites themselves. Marcus was moving before conscious decision registered, his alpha wolf driven by instinct to protect pack, even when protection meant risking himself. He hit the white with enough force to shatter bones if it had been living creature, his jaws closing on what should have been vulnerable throat, except there was nothing vulnerable about spiritual corruption wearing flesh as disguise. The white turned its attention to him, and Marcus found himself staring into eyes that glowed with sickly yellow light and held intelligence that was definitely not animal. "Thornfield blood," it said, words coming from throat that should not have been capable of speech. "The murderer's heir comes to visit his ancestor's crimes. Does it burn, General, knowing everything you have built stands on foundation of betrayal and stolen lives?" Marcus released his grip and backed away, reverting to human form through force of will that cost him enormous effort. Shifting between forms rapidly was draining under best circumstances. Doing it while hyper-aware of pack bonds screaming warnings and Davies slowly dying was nearly impossible. But he needed his human voice for what came next. "I don't know what you are or what you think my ancestor did, but we can discuss it after my soldier is stabilized. Stand down or I will be forced to eliminate you." The white made sound that could have been laughter or sobbing, the distinction lost in the wrongness of its voice. "You cannot eliminate us, foolish pup. We are what remains of those your great-grandfather murdered and imprisoned. We are the consequence of his choice to value victory over honor, and we will haunt every Thornfield until the debt is paid in full." It released Davies and simply faded back into the trees, the other whites following without Marcus needing to drive them away. The abruptness of their withdrawal was somehow more disturbing than if they had pressed the attack, suggesting they had achieved whatever purpose brought them here, and felt no need to waste energy on further conflict. Marcus shifted back to Wolf long enough to help carry Davies to the fallback position, his alpha strength making it possible to support wounded soldier while maintaining defensive awareness. The shift back to human afterward left him shaking with exhaustion and spiritual depletion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. But there was no time to recover because Davies was dying and Morrison was already dead, and the after-action report was not going to write itself. The medic worked on Davies with grim efficiency, trying to stabilize damage that went beyond anything normal healing could address. The corruption the white had introduced was spreading through Davies' system like infection, turning his skin gray and his eyes toward that same yellow glow the whites themselves carried. Without intervention, he would become one of them within hours, another victim of the conflict that had been consuming wolves for as long as Marcus had been alive. Ethan appeared beside him in human form, having shifted back while Marcus was helping with Davies, and the grim expression on his face communicated everything Marcus needed to know about their casualty status. Morrison confirmed KYA, sir. Davies critical and deteriorating. The rest of 2nd Platoon made it back with 3 wounded but stable. Total mission outcome, we prevented breakthrough to the civilian convoy, but at cost of 1 dead and 1 likely dying. The tactical victory feels pretty hollow right now. Marcus nodded slowly, too exhausted to do more than acknowledge the assessment. 128 now. The number climbed and never stopped climbing, each name a person who had trusted him to make the right calls and paid for his decisions with their lives. They evacuated Davies immediately, loaded him onto transport with medics who specialized in spiritual contamination, knowing even as they did it that conventional medicine had no answer for what was happening to him. The young soldier was still conscious, still aware enough to understand he was transforming into the very thing they had been fighting, and the look in his eyes as the transport pulled away would haunt Marcus for years to come. The sun was rising when they finally made it back to Forward Operating Base Iron Peak. Exhausted soldiers moving with the particular weariness that came from surviving another fight that should have killed them. Marcus dismissed them to get food and rest, made sure the wounded were transferred to proper medical care, then stood alone in the center of the compound and let the weight of command press down until his knees wanted to buckle. His wolf was quiet now, exhausted from the rapid shifting and the spiritual drain of combat. But even in dormancy, he could feel it processing the deaths through instincts that human mind could not fully access. The pack was smaller, the bonds fewer, and the alpha in him registered that loss as fundamentally wrong in ways that transcended tactical calculations. His pack should be growing stronger, should be thriving under his leadership, but instead, it was being whittled away by enemy they could not truly defeat. Sergeant Major Owen Hayes found him there an hour later, standing in the same spot because moving required making decisions about what came next, and Marcus was temporarily out of capacity for decisions. Hayes was 62 years old, with 38 years of service, and right now, every one of those years showed in the lines of his face and the weight in his shoulders. "Sir, need to talk to you about my grandson." Marcus's stomach dropped because he knew what was coming. Had been dreading this conversation since the moment he saw young Private Daniel Hayes go down during the initial white contact. Daniel had been 21 years old, bright and capable with his whole life ahead of him, and now he was one more name on a list that never stopped growing. They found privacy in the senior NCO quarters, Hayes sitting on his bunk with Daniel's personal effects laid out beside him with the careful precision of a man using ritual to maintain control. Marcus wanted to offer comfort, wanted to say something that would make this hurt less, but he had said those words too many times before, and they were starting to feel meaningless even to him. "He died protecting his squad mates, Sergeant Major. Drew fire deliberately to give them time to extract. Saved 3 lives through his actions. His mother is going to ask me why, sir. Why her boy? Why we're fighting enemies we can't kill? Why this war seems to have no purpose beyond grinding up young lives and spitting out grief. And I don't have answer for her because I don't understand it myself anymore." The raw honesty in Hayes's voice cut through Marcus's exhaustion and touched something deeper, the doubt he had been carrying for years about whether any of this actually mattered. They were fighting whites because whites attacked them, had been attacking for as long as Marcus could remember, but nobody seemed to know why the conflict started or how it could end. Just endless cycle of violence and casualty reports and medals pinned on grieving families who would trade every honor for having their loved ones back alive. "I don't know either, Owen, and I'm tired of pretending I have answers when all I have are more questions and a list of names that gets longer every day. Something has to change. We can't keep doing this." Hayes looked at him with expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been hope. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" "Granted." "Then find out what needs to change and change it. You're General Marcus Thornfield. You have authority and reputation and ability to make things happen that enlisted guys like me don't have access to. Use it. Figure out why we're really fighting these things and what it would take to stop. Because if we don't stop, if this just continues until there's nobody left, then every death, including my grandson's, was for absolutely nothing." The words settled over Marcus like a mission brief, clear and actionable, despite the enormous scope of what Hayes was asking. Find out why, figure out how to fix it, use his authority to make changes that Pentagon brass and political establishment would resist, because admitting the current approach was not working meant admitting decades of military doctrine had been fundamentally flawed. But what was the alternative? Keep fighting and keep losing until there was nobody left to remember why they started? Marcus made the decision that would change everything. Standing in those NCO quarters, with a grieving grandfather who deserved better than empty platitudes about honor and sacrifice. "I'm going to request a specialist consultant from Pentagon, someone who thinks differently, who approaches this problem from angles we haven't considered. And if that means going against tradition or protocol or the comfortable assumptions we have been operating under, then so be it. Your grandson and 127 others deserve better than business as usual." The call to Pentagon went through channels that resisted every step of the way. Generals who thought Marcus was wasting resources on pseudoscience, and politicians who worried about the optics of admitting they needed help. But Marcus had built enough political capital through years of successful operations that he could spend some of it on unconventional requests, and 3 days later the specialist arrived. Dr. Nora Ashwin stepped off the transport helicopter, and the first thing Marcus noticed was her scent. Every alpha learned to read the subtle chemical signatures that identified other wolves, and Nora's omega status was immediately apparent in the particular sweetness that marked her as fundamentally different from the alpha and beta wolves that made up most of the military. It triggered instincts in his wolf that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with the primal drive to protect, to claim, to ensure the safety of one who would be vulnerable in ways alphas never quite were. He pushed down the response with practice born from years of maintaining professional distance, focused on evaluating her as the specialist he had requested, rather than the omega his wolf wanted to react to. She was 34 years old, according to her file. Former trauma surgeon, who had served 2 tours in war zones before pivoting to research that most of her peers dismissed as fringe science. She moved through the chaos of the forward operating base with calm competence, not intimidated by the predominantly alpha military culture, or the skeptical looks she was getting from soldiers who questioned what an Omega civilian could possibly teach them about combat. Ethan had set up a secure briefing space in the operations center, and Marcus met her there with carefully maintained professional demeanor that did not quite cover how aware his wolf was of her presence. The Omega scent was stronger in the enclosed space, triggering responses he had not felt in years, because maintaining relationships was difficult when you spent most of your time in war zones sending soldiers to their deaths. She shook his hand with a grip that was firm without trying to prove anything, met his eyes with the directness of someone who was used to dealing with military hierarchy and had no patience for posturing. General Thornfield, thank you for requesting my consultation, despite what I'm sure was significant resistance from your chain of command. I know my theories are not exactly mainstream. Dr. Ashwin, and yes, there was resistance. Half my officers think you're a waste of resources, and the other half think I've lost my mind. Feel free to prove them wrong at your earliest convenience. She smiled slightly at that, an expression that suggested she had heard similar skepticism many times before. I'll do my best, though fair warning, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound completely insane. Your initial reaction will probably be to dismiss everything as the delusions of someone who has spent too much time studying things that don't exist. Try to push through that and look at the evidence before deciding I'm crazy. Marcus felt his wolf stir with interest, despite the exhaustion still weighing on him from the morning's combat. There was something about the way she carried herself, the confidence underlying her acknowledgement of skepticism, that suggested she knew exactly how radical her theories were, and had evidence strong enough to present them anyway. They spent the next 4 hours going through tactical reports and casualty statistics and encounter documentation, Nora presenting her case with methodical precision that reminded Marcus of the best intelligence analysts he had worked with. She showed him patterns in the white attacks, correlations between spiritual energy fluctuations and incursion frequency, historical data that suggested the conflict had not always existed in its current form. And gradually, despite his training in rationalist materialism and conventional military doctrine, Marcus found himself leaning forward with the uncomfortable realization that she might actually be right. The whites are not a separate enemy force. They're warrior spirits who have been imprisoned and corrupted, and every time we fight them, we're essentially battling our own ancestors who are trapped in perpetual suffering. Your great-grandfather, General Silas Thornfield, performed a ritual 85 years ago that bound these spirits and created the conflict you have been fighting your entire career. Marcus wanted to dismiss it, wanted to fall back on comfortable assumptions about Silas being a hero and war being necessary against external threats. But he kept thinking about the dying white's words, about how it had recognized his name and called him heir to crimes he did not understand. If what you're saying is true, then where's the evidence? My great-grandfather's service record is exemplary. Every historical account portrays him as the general who ended the war with humans and secured lasting peace. Why would he imprison spirits? What could possibly have motivated that? Nora pulled out a document that made Marcus's breath catch. Old paper carefully preserved with handwriting he recognized from family letters and historical archives. Silas Thornfield's personal journal. Pages that should not exist because official records claimed all his private papers had been destroyed in a fire shortly after his death. I found this in classified military archives, hidden inside a box labeled as meteorological data from 1941. Someone buried it deliberately, made sure it would not be found unless someone was specifically looking in places that made no sense. I've only accessed these 3 pages, but they're enough to establish that Operation Ashgate was not what the official history claims. Marcus read his great-grandfather's handwriting, words written in cramped, precise script that spoke of impossible choices and consequences that would echo through generations. The entries were fragmentary, torn from some larger context, but what remained was enough to shake the foundation of everything he thought he knew about Silas's legacy. The entry was dated December 7, 1942, just days before Operation Ashgate allegedly ended the war, and it spoke of warrior spirits demanding war crimes as price of cooperation, of high command pressuring Silas to develop alternative methods, of choices narrowing until every option looked like betrayal of one principle or another. Marcus set down the journal with hands that wanted to shake, met Nora's silver gray eyes that watched him with mixture of sympathy and determination. "We need to find the rest of this, all of it. Whatever Silas did, whatever really happened during Operation Ashgate, I need to know the full truth before I can decide what to do about it." "I was hoping you would say that. The base archivist owes me a favor, and I'm reasonably certain the rest of the journals are buried somewhere in storage containers that haven't been opened in decades. It's going to take time to find them, but if you're willing to invest that time, I believe we can uncover exactly what happened and why the whites exist." Marcus thought about Morrison and Davies and Hayes's grandson, and 127 other names carved into his conscience. Thought about the endless cycle of violence that seemed to serve no purpose beyond perpetuating itself. Thought about his duty to the soldiers under his command versus his duty to the legacy of a great-grandfather he had spent his life trying to emulate. And he made the choice that would either save his people or destroy everything he had built. We find those journals, whatever it takes, however long it requires. And once we know the truth, we figure out how to fix what Silas broke. The search took 2 full days of digging through storage containers and moldy boxes and accumulated detritus of decades of record-keeping. But eventually they found it. 16 notebooks, each one filled with Silas's handwriting, documenting in excruciating detail the descent from honored commander to war criminal who justified atrocity in the name of victory. Marcus read them alone in his quarters through the night, unable to stop even as the words carved wounds in everything he had believed about his family. Nora waited outside, giving him privacy for this particular destruction of worldview, but available when he needed to process what he was learning. The story that emerged bore no resemblance to the heroic narrative taught in every academy. Silas had commanded the Spirit Walker Corps, elite warriors bonded with spirit guides who made them nearly invincible in combat. For 18 months, they had operated with 0 casualties, winning impossible battles through partnership between wolves and spirits that went beyond normal pack bonds into something that approached symbiosis. But High Command wanted decisive victory, wanted the war ended before another generation was consumed by it, and they pressured Silas to use his Spirit Walker Corps in an operation that the spirits refused to support because it required killing civilians. The lead Spirit Walker, Captain Nora Ashwin, sided with the spirits over her commanding officer, told Silas that there were lines that could not be crossed without losing everything that made them different from their enemies. Marcus felt his wolf stir with recognition at the name, even before Nora confirmed what he was starting to suspect. Nora Ashwin, who Silas had loved and murdered in the same terrible night. Nora Ashwin, whose descendant now stood outside his quarters, carrying the same silver-gray eyes and the same Omega status, and the same absolute conviction that some principles mattered more than victory. The journals documented Silas's research into forbidden rituals, his experiments with binding and containment, the moment when High Command gave him an order that was not a request. Develop a way to weaponize spirit energy or be relieved of command and court-martialed for dereliction of duty during wartime. Silas had performed the ritual on December 15, 1942, in a clearing that would later become known as the Dead Zone. He murdered Elena and 50 spirit walkers from his own unit, used their deaths to trap warrior spirits in containment field that cut them off from the physical world, then deployed their stolen energy as a weapon that vaporized 40,000 people in an instant. The war ended because what remained of enemy leadership surrendered rather than face complete annihilation. Silas was declared a hero, given medals and honors, and a legacy that carried his name forward as architect of peace. The Spirit Walker Corps was quietly disbanded, the truth about Operation Ashgate buried under convenient lies, and for 85 years the Thornfield family built their reputation on mass murder disguised as military brilliance. Marcus finished reading as dawn was breaking, sat staring at his great-grandfather's final entry, with hands clenched tight enough to leave marks. The spirits are screaming. I can hear them even through the containment, their rage and betrayal echoing through my mind in ways I cannot block. Elena's voice is loudest, calling my name not with hatred, but with grief that cuts deeper than any accusation could. High Command says this is victory, that I saved the Wolf Nation, that history will remember me as the general who won the war. But victory tastes like ash and blood and the screaming of those I murdered, and I know with absolute certainty that I have cursed my family and my people to pay for this choice long after I am dust." Marcus walked out into the dawn, where Nora was waiting, and the look on her face told him she knew exactly what he had discovered even before he spoke. "Your great-grandmother was Elena Ashwin. That's why you have her eyes, why you carry Omega status, even though it's relatively rare in modern wolves, why you've spent years researching what happened when most people would have just accepted the official history." She nodded slowly, expression mixing grief and something that might have been relief at finally having the truth acknowledged. "I'm her direct descendant through her younger sister, who survived because she was on medical leave when Silas performed his ritual. For 10 years I've been trying to understand what happened, trying to find evidence that would prove the sanitized version of history was a lie. Now I know. Your great-grandfather murdered mine, used her death to power a weapon that killed 40,000 more, and imprisoned the warrior spirits who witnessed it all." Marcus should have felt defensive anger, should have wanted to protect family honor, or argue that Silas had been forced into an impossible situation. Instead, he felt something closer to relief, as if finally knowing the truth lifted a weight he had been carrying without realizing it. "I need to see them, the spirits, whatever remains of them in the dead zone. I need to understand what Silas did and what it's going to take to fix it, even if fixing it means destroying everything my family built on the foundation of his crimes." The dead zone perimeter was 20 clicks north of Iron Peak Base, boundary marked by deteriorating spiritual energy that made even the most hardened soldiers uncomfortable. Marcus took a small team, just Ethan and Nora, and 2 volunteers who understood the risks, and they approached on foot because the corruption did something to mechanical systems that made vehicles unreliable. The transition was immediate and visceral, reality becoming slightly wrong in ways that made Marcus's wolf whine with distress. His shifted senses picked up wrongness that human perception could not quite process, spiritual energy that had been twisted into patterns that violated natural order. The pack bonds that normally connected him to his soldiers felt strained here, stretched thin by whatever force saturated this space. Whites appeared within minutes, drawn to living presence the way predators scented prey, but they did not attack immediately. Instead, they circled, watching with those horrible yellow eyes, and Marcus could see intelligence in them beneath the corruption and madness. One moved closer than the others, larger and more coherent than the rest, and when it shifted to human form, Marcus felt his wolf recognize it as Alpha, despite the spiritual contamination. The face was familiar from historical photographs, features he had seen in archives documenting Silas's command staff. General Raymond Kane was Silas's executive officer, tried to stop the ritual, got imprisoned alongside the spirits as punishment for loyalty to principle over chain of command. You want to understand what your ancestor did? I'll show you everything, every choice, every moment where he could have turned back and chose power over honor instead. Kane's spiritual presence was overwhelming even in corrupted state. The kind of command authority that came from decades of leadership and absolute certainty in one's principles. He gestured, and suddenly Marcus was experiencing visions, pulled into memories that showed him Operation Ashgate from perspectives he had never imagined. He saw Silas struggling with impossible choices, saw Elena arguing for principles while knowing it might cost her life, saw the warrior spirits making demands they had no right to make, saw high command applying pressure that turned command into coercion, saw the exact moment when Silas decided that mass murder of enemies was preferable to potential genocide of his own people, when he chose victory through atrocity over defeat with honor. He saw Elena's last moments, saw her forgiveness even as the blade took her life, saw Silas weeping as he performed the ritual that would curse generations of people who had no part in his decisions. And he saw the warrior spirits screaming as the containment field trapped them, their power weaponized against every principle they had claimed to uphold. When the visions released him, Marcus was on his knees with tears streaming down his face, and Nora supporting him, while Ethan stood guard against whites that made no move to attack. Kane watched with expression that mixed judgment and something that might have been pity. Now you understand. Your great-grandfather was not evil man who enjoyed cruelty. He was soldier who followed orders past the point where orders should have been refused, who believed winning justified any means, who chose expedience over principle when the cost of principle seemed too high to pay. and we spirits were not innocent victims. We demanded our own war crimes first, created the impossible situation through our own moral failures. Everyone who was involved carries guilt, and simple narratives of heroes and villains serve no one. Marcus forced himself to his feet, meeting Kane's eyes despite wanting to look away from everything those eyes represented. What would it take to fix this? To free you from this prison? To end the cycle of suffering on both sides? Breach the dead zone, reach the nexus where Silas performed the ritual, reverse the containment field and release us back into the world. But understand that releasing us means confronting 300 spirits who have spent 85 years cultivating rage and planning revenge alongside 200 who have maintained hope for reconciliation. Free us all, and you get both factions, not just the ones who will make your life easier. Kane moved closer, his corrupted form flickering between states. And you need to understand something else, General Thornfield. Some of us cannot be saved. The corruption has damaged us beyond healing, twisted us so fundamentally that we will never be what we were. Your great-grandfather did not just imprison us. He broke us in ways that time cannot fix. Any solution you attempt will be incomplete, will leave some of us still suffering, and you will have to live with that failure the same way Silas lived with his. Marcus thought about Hayes and Morrison and 128 names that haunted his sleep. Thought about the choice between perpetual conflict that consumed more lives every year, or attempting fix that might unleash something worse than current situation. Thought about duty to the dead versus responsibility to the living. And he made his choice, standing in that corrupted clearing with a general who had paid ultimate price for choosing conscience over orders. I'm going to breach the dead zone. I'm going to reverse what Silas did. And whatever consequences follow, whatever price needs to be paid for 85 years of imprisonment and suffering, I'll face it without complaint. Because the alternative is watching this cycle continue until there's nobody left to remember why we were fighting. Kane studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then prepare yourself, Marcus Thornfield. Prepare your soldiers, prepare your people, prepare for everything you know to change in ways you cannot predict or control. Because once you start down this path, there is no going back to comfortable ignorance. You will know the truth, and truth has consequences that comfortable lies never required you to face. They left the dead zone with Marcus's resolve hardened into certainty, despite the warnings and the risks, and the knowledge that he was about to make decisions that would probably destroy his career. Nora walked beside him, close enough that he could smell her omega scent mixing with his alpha presence in ways that his wolf registered as fundamentally right, even though his human mind knew the complications of mixing military authority with personal attraction. She seemed to sense his awareness because she glanced at him with slight smile that acknowledged the tension without making it awkward. Your wolf is reacting to me. I can tell by the way you keep checking wind direction and positioning yourself between me and potential threats, even though I'm perfectly capable of handling myself. Marcus felt heat rise in his face, embarrassed at being called out on instincts he thought he had been hiding. Professional hazard of being alpha in military context. We're trained to assess threats and protect our people. And those instincts don't always distinguish between soldiers who can defend themselves and omegas who trigger different protective responses. I apologize if it's making you uncomfortable. It's not uncomfortable, just interesting. Most alphas either ignore omega status completely because they're trying so hard to be professional, or they use it as excuse to be condescending and controlling. You're doing something different, trying to balance respect for my competence with instincts that are telling you I need protection. It's kind of refreshing, actually. They walked in silence for a few minutes, both processing the implications of acknowledging the attraction that had been building since she arrived. We're going to work together to fix this, Marcus said finally. To breach the dead zone and free the spirits and deal with whatever consequences follow. That's going to require trust and partnership, and probably putting ourselves in situations where the boundaries between professional and personal become harder to maintain. I need to know if that's going to be a problem for you. Nora met his eyes directly, her omega status somehow making her seem more, rather than less, formidable. It won't be a problem as long as you remember that I'm here as expert consultant who happens to be omega, not as omega who needs alpha protection while attempting to do my job. Respect my competence, and I'll respect your instincts, and we'll figure out how to work together without letting biology dictate our professional relationship. It was reasonable and clear and exactly the kind of boundary setting that made it possible to function in mixed rank and designation environments. and Marcus felt his wolf settle slightly at having the rules established, even as his human side remained very aware of how attractive he found her confidence. Back at Iron Peak Base, Marcus made the call that would change everything. He formally requested authorization to conduct full breach of the dead zone, to attempt reversal of Operation Ashgate, and to seek reconciliation with imprisoned spirits, even knowing it would face massive resistance from chain of command and political establishment. The response came back within 24 hours. Request denied, Marcus ordered to cease all investigation into classified operations, Consultant Ashwin to be removed from base immediately, and Marcus himself to report for formal review of decisions made without proper authorization. Marcus read the orders twice, then set them aside and began planning the operation that would either save his people or destroy everything he had spent his career building. Because sometimes being a leader meant knowing when orders were wrong and having courage to refuse them, even when refusal meant losing everything. He assembled his team in the briefing room 72 hours after returning from the dead zone. Volunteers only, everyone understanding that what they were about to attempt could result in court-martial at minimum. Ethan stood beside the tactical display, ready to walk through approach vectors and contingency routes. Sarah sat in the front row, looking determined, despite Marcus having told her she was not on the roster. Nora was there with her research materials, ready to explain the ritual reversal in detail, and Marcus stood before them, Alpha General about to lead his pack into a situation that conventional wisdom said was suicide, and felt the weight of command settle over him one more time. Operation Redemption begins in 72 hours. Between now and then, we plan every detail, we prepare for every contingency, and we make our peace with the fact that none of us may survive what comes next. But we're doing this anyway, because 128 soldiers deserve better than dying to perpetuate their great-great-grandfather's crimes. And because if we don't fix this now, the cycle will just continue until there's nobody left. He looked at each face, Alpha and Beta and Omega all together in common purpose, pack bonds connecting them even without formal ceremony, because they had chosen to follow him into the impossible. 72 hours to prepare. Then we breach the dead zone, free the spirits, and face whatever judgment they have earned the right to deliver. Questions? Sarah raised her hand, the only person in the room with courage to challenge him. Sir, I'm volunteering for the mission, and I expect you to respect my right to make that choice. Marcus met his daughter's eyes, saw the determination there that reminded him painfully of himself at that age, and felt the alpha in him war with the father in him over what came next. But that was a conversation for later, in privacy, where pack bonds and family ties could be acknowledged without undermining command authority. For now, he had an operation to plan, and 72 hours to prepare for the choice that would define everything that came after. Outside the briefing room, the sun was setting over Iron Peak Base, last light falling on a world that was about to change in ways nobody could fully predict. Marcus stood at the window watching it fade, feeling Nora's presence beside him, and the pack bonds connecting him to everyone who had chosen to follow him into the unknown. 128 names carved into his conscience, and 72 hours until he attempted to ensure their deaths actually meant something beyond perpetual conflict management. It would have to be enough. The planning began. 72 hours of intensive planning had brought them to this moment. 15 wolves gathered in the briefing room at 0600, while Marcus tried to convince himself he was not leading them all to their deaths. The volunteers represented every rank and designation: alphas who commanded with natural authority, betas who provided the stable backbone of military operations, and 3 omegas whose presence in a combat operation was unprecedented enough to generate resistance from traditionalists who believed some roles were not meant for those they perceived as inherently vulnerable. Nora sat among the omegas with quiet confidence that suggested she had faced this particular brand of skepticism before and had long since stopped caring what people thought of her competence. But Marcus could feel through his alpha senses the way some of the other wolves were reacting to her presence. The subtle territorial posturing that said they viewed Omega participation in dangerous operations as either foolish idealism or inappropriate intrusion into spaces that should remain alpha-dominated. Lieutenant Sarah Thornfield sat in the front row with expression that dared her father to try benching her again, having spent the last 3 days arguing that her skills qualified her for the mission, regardless of their family connection. Marcus had eventually conceded the point, not because she wore him down, but because she was right. Her tactical abilities and leadership experience making her legitimately one of the best choices for the team, even setting aside the complication of her being his daughter. Ethan stood beside the tactical display, already marked with approach vectors they had refined through endless iteration, ready to walk through the operational plan one final time before they committed to a course of action that had no authorization from anyone above Marcus in the chain of command. His beta presence was steady as always, the kind of unshakable reliability that made Marcus grateful for 20 years of partnership that had weathered every crisis through trust and mutual respect. Operation Redemption is not sanctioned by High Command, not approved by Pentagon oversight, not authorized by anyone except my own judgment as field commander. That means if we proceed, every person in this room is committing career suicide at minimum, and possibly facing court-martial for insubordination and violation of direct orders to cease investigation into classified operations. Marcus paused, letting that settle, watching for any signs of wavering or second thoughts. The objective is to breach the dead zone, penetrate to the spirit nexus where my great-grandfather performed the containment ritual 85 years ago, and reverse that ritual to free the imprisoned warrior spirits. We have reason to believe this will end the white incursions and cure the wasting plague. We also have reason to believe the freed spirits may be hostile and could pose existential threat to the Northern Territories. Sarah raised her hand before Marcus could continue, forcing the confrontation he had been avoiding. Sir, my name is still not on the official roster, despite my qualifications clearly meeting mission requirements. I request clarification on what operational criteria I'm failing that justifies my exclusion. Every eye in the room turned to Marcus, waiting to see how he would handle being challenged by his own daughter in front of subordinates. His alpha wolf stirred with instinct to establish dominance, to shut down the challenge through sheer force of presence. But his human mind recognized the trap of letting biology override professional judgment. Your qualifications are not in question, Lieutenant. Your exclusion is based on my assessment that having my daughter on a mission with high probability of casualties would compromise my tactical decision-making at critical moments. That is not reflection on your competence. That is acknowledgement of my own limitations as commander, who cannot fully separate personal attachment from professional necessity. With respect, sir, that is exactly the kind of thinking that has kept Omegas out of combat roles for generations. The assumption that personal connections make soldiers unreliable, that caring about the people you serve with is weakness rather than strength. If you truly believe in the partnership model we're trying to build with the spirits, you need to start demonstrating that alphas can trust their pack even when that pack includes people they love. The words hit harder than Sarah probably intended, cutting through the military protocol to touch something deeper about the changes Marcus was trying to implement. She was right that his protective instincts were overriding professional evaluation, right that excluding her sent message about Omega capability that contradicted everything he claimed to believe about equal partnership, regardless of designation. Marcus felt his certainty crack, the careful justifications he had built around keeping Sarah safe, revealing themselves as exactly the kind of paternalistic authority he was fighting against in broader context. You're right. And I'm adding your name to the roster effective immediately, not because you argued well, but because you're correct that I was letting alpha protective instincts override tactical necessity. But Lieutenant, understand that if something happens to you out there, if you're injured or killed because I brought you on this mission, I will carry that weight for the rest of my life. Sarah's expression softened slightly, acknowledgement that she understood the cost of what she was asking. I know, Dad, but you're already carrying 128 names. What's one more if it means I got to stand beside you when it mattered most? The briefing continued with Sarah officially added to the team, Ethan walking through tactical details while Marcus tried to focus on operational planning instead of the fear that was screaming through his alpha instincts. Having his daughter on this mission felt wrong in ways he could not articulate, protective drives clashing with professional necessity, but excluding her would have undermined the principles he was supposedly fighting for. Nora caught his attention after the briefing concluded, waiting until the room had mostly cleared before approaching with expression that suggested she had read the entire emotional subtext of the exchange with Sarah. That was hard for you, acknowledging that your instinct to protect was overriding her right to make her own choices about acceptable risk. Is it that obvious? To anyone who understands pack dynamics and alpha psychology, yes, but it was also exactly the right call, both tactically and symbolically. Sarah's participation demonstrates that this operation is about more than just fixing your great-grandfather's mistakes. It's about building different model of leadership that values partnership over protection. They stood together in the empty briefing room, Marcus hyper-aware of Nora's Omega scent, and the way his wolf kept trying to position himself between her and the door in unconscious protective gesture that she probably noticed but was polite enough not to comment on. "I've never worked this closely with an Omega before," he admitted. "Military culture tends to segregate by designation, alphas in command and combat roles, betas in support and technical positions, Omegas in medical and administrative functions. Having you here as equal partner in tactical operation is different." "Different how? Uncomfortable? Distracting?" "Different in that it challenges assumptions I didn't realize I was carrying about who belongs in what roles. You're competent and courageous and absolutely qualified to be here, and my alpha instincts keep trying to categorize you as someone who needs protection rather than someone who can protect herself. It's cognitive dissonance I'm still processing." Nora smiled slightly, appreciation for the honesty. "At least you're aware enough to recognize the dissonance and question it. Most alphas just act on their protective instincts and get offended when Omegas object to being treated as fragile. The fact that you're examining your assumptions means you're already further along than most in understanding what genuine partnership requires." The moment stretched between them, professional boundaries and personal attraction, creating tension that neither was quite ready to acknowledge directly. Marcus's wolf recognized her as potential mate with certainty that transcended tactical considerations, responding to Omega scent and silver-gray eyes, and the particular intelligence that manifested as both strength and vulnerability. But they had a mission to plan, and lives depending on their focus, so Marcus stepped back to safe professional distance and changed the subject to logistics and approach vectors, and all the concrete details that did not require examining the connection developing between them. The Dead Zone breach launched at 1800 hours exactly, 12 wolves moving in tactical formation through terrain that became progressively more corrupted as they advanced beyond the perimeter. Marcus led in human form initially, saving his shifted strength for when they would need it most, but keeping his senses extended through pack bonds that connected him to every member of the team. He could feel Sarah's determination through their family connection, stronger than the standard pack bond, because blood ties added depth to the spiritual linking. Could feel Ethan's steady reliability and the three Omegas' mixture of fear and resolve. Could feel Nora's presence most strongly of all, her Omega energy singing through his alpha awareness in ways that made it difficult to maintain professional detachment. The whites appeared at the 2-click mark, circling but not attacking, and Marcus recognized the larger one from his previous reconnaissance. The entity that had identified itself as General Kane, Silas's betrayed executive officer who had spent 85 years imprisoned for choosing conscience over orders. "You return as promised, General Thornfield, and you bring others to witness what comes next. Are you prepared for the truth in all its terrible complexity?" "We are. We came to free you, to reverse my great-grandfather's crime, and to face whatever judgment you have earned the right to deliver." Kane made that sound that could have been laughter or grief, then gestured toward the heart of the Dead Zone. "Then come. See the nexus where Silas murdered his mate and 50 loyal soldiers. See the price of choosing victory over principle. And then we will discover whether you have the courage to pay what fixing this actually costs." The journey to the nexus took 4 hours through landscape that actively fought their passage, spiritual corruption pressing against them like physical force. At hour 2, Specialist Davies collapsed with the same spiritual contamination Marcus had seen before, his essence being drained by proximity to the concentrated wrongness. They had to evacuate him immediately, 2 soldiers escorting him back to the perimeter, while the rest continued with reduced numbers and growing awareness of how dangerous this environment truly was. Marcus shifted to wolf form to help carry equipment Davies had been handling, the transformation burning through him with familiar intensity. His alpha wolf was larger than standard, 450 pounds of muscle and fang, and in this form he could sense the spiritual wrongness more acutely than human perception allowed. The Dead Zone registered as fundamentally wrong to his wolf instincts, corruption that violated natural order in ways that made his hackles rise and his lips pull back from teeth in unconscious snarl. Through the pack bonds, he felt the others' reactions, their wolves responding to the same wrongness with varying degrees of distress. Sarah's wolf was unsettled, but holding steady, her youth giving her flexibility that older wolves sometimes lacked. Ethan's beta wolf was rock solid as always, providing stable anchor for the pack bonds. And Nora's omega energy was different, somehow less affected by the corruption, as if her designation gave her natural resistance to spiritual contamination that alphas and betas did not possess. They reached the nexus at hour 4, and the sight made Marcus shift back to human form without conscious decision, needing his voice for the horror that words could barely express. The clearing was exactly as Silas's journal had described, perfectly circular with spiritual energy so dense it was visible as shimmering distortions in the air. At the center stood an altar of black stone, and arranged around it in geometric precision were the bodies. 50 spirit walkers preserved exactly as they had died 85 years ago, their faces frozen in expressions that ranged from terror to resignation to forgiveness. Nora made a sound that was half gasp and half sob, moving forward like someone in trance until she stood beside the body that could have been her reflection, aged slightly and dressed in military uniform from a different era. Nora Ashwin, the Omega Spirit Walker who had chosen principle over survival, who had died forgiving the man who murdered her. Marcus watched Nora kneel beside her great-grandmother's body and felt something shift in his chest, recognition that went beyond tactical partnership into territory he had been avoiding. This Omega, who had walked into his life a week ago, carrying Elena's eyes and Elena's courage and Elena's absolute conviction that some things mattered more than safety. She was not just consultant or ally. She was becoming something more, something his wolf recognized even as his human mind tried to maintain professional distance. General Kane manifested at the clearing's edge, his corrupted form more coherent here at the heart of his prison. Behind him came others, hundreds of warrior spirits filling the nexus with presence that pressed against Marcus's consciousness like weight. Now you see the truth in all its terrible detail. 50 murdered to power a weapon that killed 40,000 more. 85 years of imprisonment and corruption for witnessing crimes your great-grandfather committed. And through it all, Elena's forgiveness, her belief that Silas could have chosen differently, that the situation was not truly impossible, but only felt that way because he lacked courage to refuse orders he knew were wrong. Kane moved closer to where Marcus stood, spiritual energy manifesting as almost physical pressure. To reverse the ritual requires 3 elements: Thornfield blood freely given, Ashwin blood freely given, and voluntary sacrifice of life force to replace what was stolen when Silas bound us here. Can you pay this price, General? Can you offer your blood and potentially your life to fix what your ancestor broke? Marcus met Kane's eyes without flinching, Alpha Wolf rising to the challenge even knowing he might not survive it. I can and I will. Whatever it costs, whatever sacrifice is required, I accept it as payment for 85 years of suffering my bloodline caused. Nora stood from beside Elena's body, moving to Marcus's side with determination written in every line of her posture. And I offer Ashwin blood as Elena's direct descendant, as Omega carrying her legacy, and her gift for spirit walking. We do this together, Thornfield and Ashwin. Partnership instead of the dominance that broke everything. Chaplain Ruth Harker stepped forward, 68 years old and steady despite the weight of spiritual presence. And I offer life force freely given, not through death as Silas's victims provided it, but through voluntary transfer that will leave me weakened but alive. Let this be healing rather than more murder, restoration rather than perpetuation of violence. The ritual itself was less dramatic than Marcus had anticipated and more emotionally devastating. He cut his palm with the blade Silas had used 85 years ago. Let his alpha blood fall onto the altar, where his great-grandfather's blood had powered the original binding. Nora did the same, her omega blood mixing with his in symbolic union of the 2 bloodlines that Silas had severed through murder. And in that moment when their blood touched, something shifted inside Marcus that had nothing to do with the ritual and everything to do with connection forming between them. The pack bond that had been developing strengthened suddenly into something more, mate bonds snapping into place with force that stole his breath. Through that connection, he felt Nora's shock and recognition, her omega energy reaching for his alpha presence in response that was as instinctive as breathing. The bond carried emotions and sensations neither had intended to share. Awareness of attraction that had been building since the moment they met. Respect and fear and desperate hope that what they were attempting would actually work. Marcus felt her determination and her grief for Elena, felt the weight of carrying a legacy of murdered ancestors while trying to build peace with their killers. And beneath it all, he felt her response to him as alpha, the particular pull that Omega felt toward compatible mate that transcended professional boundaries. Nora's eyes met his across the altar, and he saw his own shock reflected there, recognition that they had just bound themselves together in ways that went far beyond tactical partnership. The mate bond was not supposed to form without intention, was supposed to require conscious choice and formal ceremony, but apparently, proximity during powerful spiritual ritual could trigger it involuntarily when the compatibility was strong enough. But there was no time to process what had just happened, because Chaplain Harker was beginning the life force transfer, and the ritual was activating, and the containment field that had held warrior spirits for 85 years was starting to crack. That was when Senator James Lockwood's private military contractors stormed the Nexus. They came from multiple directions with professional precision, heavily armed and clearly briefed on what they would find. Marcus's team responded instantly, but they were outnumbered 3-1 and caught in crossfire that gave them almost no good options. Lockwood himself appeared at the clearing's edge, flanked by security, looking like a man who had made terrible decision and committed to it anyway. "General Thornfield, step away from that altar immediately. I am invoking emergency authority under the National Security Act to prevent you from releasing entities that pose clear and present danger to the Northern Territories." Marcus moved to position himself between Lockwood and the altar, very aware that he was unarmed and his tactical position was completely untenable. "Senator, those entities are warrior spirits we imprisoned through war crimes. You want to perpetuate that crime to protect your political interests and your father's complicity? I want to protect thousands of lives that will be lost if you unleash spirits who have spent 85 years cultivating rage. My father confessed everything on his deathbed, told me about Silas's crimes and High Command's orders and the impossible situation they faced. Yes, they made terrible choice, but they made it because the alternative was potential extinction of the Wolf Nation, and you want to risk that same extinction because you feel guilty about inheriting their legacy?" The contractors were advancing, weapons trained on Marcus's people, who were massively outgunned. And through the mate bond, Marcus felt Nora's spike of fear not for herself, but for him standing exposed between armed forces with nothing but his authority as protection. His alpha wolf surged with need to shift and fight, to protect his newly bonded mate and his daughter and his pack from the threat closing in around them. The transformation was taking him before conscious thought intervened, his human form dissolving into 450 pounds of alpha fury that registered Lockwood's forces as enemies threatening his pack. But before violence could escalate, Sarah's voice cut through the tension with Commander's authority that had nothing to do with her age or rank. "Stand down! Everyone stand down right now!" She strode into the space between the two armed groups, weaponless but radiating the kind of presence that made hardened soldiers obey without questioning why. Marcus felt pride surge through him, even as his wolf fought the need to grab her and pull her back to safety. "Senator Lockwood, you are operating on military installation without authorization, deploying private contractors in violation of multiple regulations, and threatening lethal force against active duty soldiers. As acting commander of this facility in my father's absence, I order you to withdraw immediately." Lockwood stared at her like she had lost her mind. "Lieutenant, your father is committing treason. I am here to stop him before he destroys everything. My father is attempting to fix war crime committed by his ancestor. You are here to protect your financial interests and your father's reputation. I know which of those positions holds moral high ground." She turned to address both groups, young lieutenant who should not have had authority for this, but was taking it anyway. "Here is what's going to happen. Senator Lockwood, you will withdraw your contractors and allow the ritual to proceed. In exchange, General Thornfield will agree to partial liberation. We free the spirits who want reconciliation first, prove that cooperation is possible, then negotiate with the rest about terms that satisfy their needs without requiring mass violence." She looked at Kane, fearless in the face of spiritual entity that could probably destroy her with a thought. General Kane, you said some of your people want peace. Release them first. Let them work with us to demonstrate that wolves and spirits can partner successfully. Use that success to convince the others that revenge serves no purpose if peaceful alternatives exist. Marcus shifted back to human form, the transformation leaving him shaking with adrenaline and spiritual depletion. And through the mate bond, he felt Nora's relief so intense it nearly buckled his knees. She was beside him immediately, Omega instincts driving her to check him for injuries, even though logically she knew shifting itself did not cause harm. "I'm fine," he murmured, touching her shoulder in reassurance that was probably unnecessary, but his alpha wolf needed the contact to confirm she was safe. "Sarah's plan is good. We should take it." Kane's form flickered as he conferred with the other spirits, hundreds of presences deliberating on whether Sarah's compromise was acceptable. Finally, he solidified again, and spoke with voice-carrying decision reached after careful consideration. "We accept. 200 of our number have maintained hope for reconciliation despite everything. They will be freed first to work with your people toward mutual healing. The remaining 300 will remain in modified containment, able to observe and communicate, but not to physically manifest, until both sides can negotiate terms that satisfy our need for justice and your need for security." Lockwood looked like he wanted to argue further, but Sarah had already positioned her team to escort his contractors off the base, and the moment for violence had passed into grudging acceptance that sometimes compromise was the only option that did not result in bloodshed. 3 months, General Thornfield. You have 3 months to prove this works. If one wolf dies due to spirit attack during that time, I'm coming back with full authority and significantly more support. And Lieutenant, your career ends the moment I return to the capital. Sarah just smiled. Sir, if my career ends because I chose preventing bloodshed over following orders I knew were wrong, I can live with that consequence. The completion of the ritual happened quickly once the interruption was resolved. The containment field shattered, and 200 warrior spirits poured through the gap, manifesting in various forms, but none of them attacking. Instead, they spread out through the nexus, testing boundaries that no longer existed, and the sound they made collectively was like weeping and laughter and prayer all mixed together. Through the mate bond, Marcus felt Nora's overwhelming relief and grief combined, her omega heart opening to the freed spirits in ways his alpha nature could not quite replicate. He reached for her hand without thinking, needing the physical contact to ground himself in the reality of what they had just accomplished, and felt her fingers interlace with his, in gesture that acknowledged the bond forming between them, even though circumstances had not allowed them to discuss it. One spirit approached Marcus directly, female form that reminded him painfully of Elena's preserved body. "I am Sergeant Kara," was Elena's closest friend and fellow spirit walker. "She would have been proud of what you attempted here today. Not because you succeeded completely, but because you tried despite knowing it could cost everything. And General, I can feel the mate bond forming between you and Elena's descendant. She chose well, as did you. Honor that bond by being worthy of it." The spirit turned to Nora, and something passed between them that Marcus could not fully perceive, but felt the weight of through their connection. "You carry her so completely, child. The courage and the conviction and the willingness to risk everything for what you believe is right. She lives on through you more truly than any memorial could capture." Then the spirits were flowing out of the nexus toward the perimeter and the world beyond, and Marcus stood with Nora's hand in his, and Sarah on his other side, and Ethan watching his back the way he had for 20 years, and felt the massive weight of responsibility for what they had just unleashed. The journey back to the perimeter took 6 hours, with half the team injured and everyone exhausted beyond the point where tactical movement was really feasible. They lost Corporal James Sullivan in the firefight with Lockwood's contractors, taking rounds while protecting Chaplain Harker, and Marcus added the name to his list that now numbered 129 souls who had died under his command. Through the mate bond, he felt Nora processing Sullivan's death alongside him, sharing the grief in ways that made it simultaneously heavier and more bearable. This was what mate bonds did, created partnership that went beyond tactical cooperation into genuine sharing of emotional burdens. For better or worse, they were bound now, and that meant whatever came next, they would face together. They reached Iron Peak Base after midnight to find chaos that was somehow both expected and worse than Marcus had anticipated. The freed spirits had spread through the surrounding area, helping heal plague victims and repair damaged crops, and making their presence known in ways that ranged from miraculous to terrifying, depending on who was experiencing it. Sarah met them at the gate with situation report that confirmed Marcus's career was essentially over, and a court-martial was almost certainly imminent. But she also reported that the spirit's integration was showing measurable positive results, with plague cure rates jumping to 80% and agricultural productivity increasing for the first time in decades. High Command wants you before a court-martial board within 48 hours. Senator Lockwood has filed formal charges. Half the officer corps wants your resignation, and the other half wants to give you a medal. It's a complete disaster, sir. Marcus nodded tiredly, having expected nothing less. And the spirits? How are the freed ones actually integrating? Sergeant Kara and about 50 others are working with medical teams, healing people conventional medicine had given up on. Another 100 are helping with infrastructure and agriculture. The remaining 50 are mostly observing, trying to understand how much the world has changed. And the Justice faction still in containment, General Kane reports they're watching closely and withholding judgment. Through the mate bond, Marcus felt Nora's exhaustion and determination combined, her Omega resilience showing itself in ways his alpha nature could only admire. She had endured physical beating during the confrontation with Lockwood's forces, had channeled enormous spiritual energy during the ritual, and was still standing ready to continue the work they had started. "Get her to medical," Marcus told Sarah quietly. "She's been through hell, and she's trying not to show it, but I can feel through the bond that she's injured worse than she wants to admit." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the acknowledgement of the mate bond, surprise and something that might have been happiness crossing her face before professional mask reasserted itself. "I'll make sure she's taken care of. And Dad, congratulations. She's exactly the kind of partner you deserve. Strong enough to challenge you, brave enough to stand beside you, and smart enough to keep you honest. Mom would have approved." The words hit harder than Marcus expected. Acknowledgement from his daughter that the mate his wolf had chosen was worthy of the bond. He had not sought this connection, had not planned for personal complications in the middle of attempting to fix generational crimes. But now that it existed, he found himself grateful for it, in ways that went beyond tactical advantage. That night, alone in his quarters, with the knowledge that court-martial was coming, and his career was ending, and everything he had built was about to collapse around him, Marcus allowed himself to feel the mate bond connecting him to Nora 2 buildings away in the medical facility. Through that connection, he could sense her sleeping, her Omega energy peaceful, despite the injuries and the chaos surrounding them, and that peace somehow made everything else bearable. They had freed 200 spirits, given them chance at reconciliation, and proven that partnership between wolves and spirits was possible if both sides were willing to try. Whatever consequences followed, whatever price he paid for defying orders and destroying his career, at least he had attempted fixing what generations before him had been content to perpetuate, and he had found his mate in the process. Omega, who carried Elena's courage, and Elena's gift for spirit walking, and Elena's absolute conviction that some things were worth risking everything for. Through the bond, he sent her wordless reassurance, alpha energy offering protection and partnership, and felt her sleepy acknowledgement in return. 3 months to prove Lockwood wrong. 3 months to demonstrate that freed spirits were assets rather than threats. 3 months to negotiate with the Justice faction and convince them that peace served their interests better than revenge. And whatever happened after those 3 months, at least he would face it with his mate beside him, and the knowledge that he had chosen conscience over expedience the way Silas never had. That would have to be enough. The court-martial proceedings began 68 hours after Marcus returned from the dead zone, 3 generals sitting in judgment, while evidence of his crimes was laid out with methodical precision. Treason, insubordination, unauthorized operations, misuse of military resources, endangerment of personnel. The charges were technically accurate and collectively devastating, and Marcus accepted them without protest, because fighting the verdict would have required lying about decisions he had made with full awareness of probable consequences. Through the mate bond, he could feel Nora in the observation gallery, her Omega presence offering support that transcended the physical distance between them. The bond had been unexpected and overwhelming, snapping into place during the ritual reversal, with force that neither had anticipated. But in the 3 days since he had come to depend on that connection, in ways that went beyond tactical partnership into territory, his wolf recognized as fundamental rightness. His defense counsel presented creative arguments about discretionary authority granted to field commanders facing unprecedented situations, but everyone in the courtroom knew it was not going to be sufficient. Marcus had violated direct orders, accessed classified information without authorization, brought civilian consultant into sensitive military operations, and committed resources to mission that High Command had explicitly denied approval for. The verdict came on day 4 after 72 hours of testimony and deliberation. Guilty on all charges except treason, which required proof of intent to harm the nation that the evidence could not support. Sentence was dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all rank and privileges, and 5 years confinement pending appeal. Marcus accepted the verdict standing at attention, then requested permission to make statement for the record. I do not dispute the facts as presented. I violated protocols knowingly and with full awareness of consequences. What I dispute is the characterization that my actions were inappropriate use of authority. 129 soldiers died under my command, fighting enemies we created through our own war crimes. I owed them the attempt to fix that, and I would make the same choice again, even knowing it would end exactly as it has. Through the mate bond, he felt Nora's pride and grief combined, her omega heart responding to his alpha declaration with intensity that made the connection between them pulse with energy that was probably visible to anyone with spiritual sensitivity. The lead general, a man Marcus had served under 20 years ago, looked at him with expression mixing respect and regret. General Thornfield, your motives may have been noble, but the precedent you set is catastrophic. If every commander can ignore oversight when they believe their cause is just, military discipline becomes meaningless. This court sympathizes with your position, but cannot condone your methods. Sentence stands as pronounced. Marcus was escorted to detention in restraints that felt both humiliating and strangely liberating, as if being officially condemned freed him from the burden of maintaining appearances. Through the mate bond, he felt Nora moving to follow, her omega instincts driving her to stay close to her newly bonded alpha, even though circumstances had not given them time to formalize or even discuss the connection that had formed between them. Sarah visited within the first hour, having submitted her resignation from military service, effective immediately after her role in defying Senator Lockwood's authority became public knowledge. They processed my discharge this morning. Apparently challenging a senator with private army gets you invited to leave at earliest convenience. She smiled with no trace of regret. But I don't regret it. You taught me that leadership means making hard calls even when they cost everything. And I applied that lesson exactly as you intended. Through the family bonds that ran deeper than standard pack connections, Marcus felt his daughter's certainty and pride, and something in his chest simultaneously broke and healed at seeing her stand firm in principles he had tried to model, despite his own failures. Nora received visitor clearance and arrived the next day looking exhausted but determined, carrying updates about integration progress and news from outside that Marcus was now isolated from, except through approved channels. The peace faction spirits are exceeding expectations. Sergeant Kara's group has healed over 300 plague victims with 92% success rate. Agricultural teams report soil vitality restoration that conventional methods said would take decades. And we're training new spirit walkers from younger wolves who show aptitude, building the next generation of partnership that Silas destroyed. She pulled out data visualizations showing measurable improvements across multiple metrics since the liberation 3 weeks ago. But Marcus found it difficult to focus on statistics when the mate bond was carrying her emotional state directly into his awareness. She was scared for him, worried about the prison sentence, grieving for what his choice had cost them both. And underneath it all was the omega drive to nest and protect and ensure her alpha's well-being that circumstances were making impossible to satisfy. But we have serious problems, she continued, forcing herself back to business despite what the bond was communicating. Some wolves are embracing spirit cooperation, but others see it as abandonment of traditional values. There have been violence incidents against spirit manifestations, and someone is coordinating the resistance into organized movement. Marcus's alpha instincts surged with need to protect her from threats he could not reach from detention. And through the bond, he felt her responding to his distress by trying to project calm she did not entirely feel. Warrant Officer Mackenzie is leading opposition. He lost his son to whites 6 years ago and sees spirit integration as betrayal of everyone who died fighting them. He's not villain, Marcus. He's grieving father who needs someone he respects to reach him before fear drives him to actions that will get people killed. The request was implicit, and Marcus knew he was probably the only person with enough credibility to negotiate with Bull Mackenzie. But reaching him would require arranging a meeting that was not exactly supported by his detention status. Nora made it happen anyway, using connections and favors to get Bull into secure room at the detention facility 3 days later. The old warrant officer looked weathered by decades of service and recent events that had shaken everything he thought was stable. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with accumulated anger. "You destroyed everything, General. Told us our ancestors were wrong, and we should welcome the very entities we've been fighting. How am I supposed to look at the memorial wall with my son's name and tell him his death was for nothing?" Marcus let him vent, understanding Bull needed to voice the pain before he could hear anything in response. "Your son's death was not for nothing. He died protecting his pack from whites that were real threats. What I'm saying is that whites existed because we created them through Silas's crime, and fighting symptoms forever is not sustainable when we can address root causes. Your service meant something. Your son meant something. But we honor their sacrifice by building peace they died trying to achieve rather than perpetuating the conflict that killed them." The spirits demanded war crimes first. Cain admitted they pushed Silas into a corner where every choice was terrible. They did, and Silas chose atrocity rather than accept defeat, and that choice has consequences we're still paying for. But Bull, we're not in 1942 anymore. The spirits we freed are not the same ones who made those demands. They've had 85 years to reflect and regret and understand that their own actions contributed to tragedy. Cain told me directly that they bear guilt too. Bull was silent for a long moment, internal struggle visible in the tension of his shoulders. "My son David was 27 when the whites killed him. I watched him bleed out and there was nothing I could do. You're asking me to work alongside entities that look exactly like the things that murdered my boy. I'm asking you to consider whether David would want you to keep fighting war with no end, or whether he would want you to help build peace so other fathers don't have to bury their sons the way you buried yours." The words landed and Bull's resistance cracked, grief overwhelming anger as he processed what Marcus was really asking of him. "I'll call off my people. Give integration a chance to work. But General, if those Justice faction spirits attack when they get released, if they hurt innocent wolves because we trusted them, I'm holding you personally responsible." Marcus accepted the terms knowing full well that if integration failed, the blood would indeed be on his hands, and through the mate bond he felt Nora's acknowledgement that they were both betting everything on assumptions that could still prove catastrophically wrong. The crisis came in week 8. Exactly when Marcus's tactical projections had suggested based on patterns of escalating tension. A splinter group from Bull's disbanded resistance, 20 wolves who had not accepted the stand-down order, launched coordinated attack on the Spirit Integration Center where Nora was working with newly trained spirit walkers. The attack was sudden and violent, designed to inflict maximum casualties before response could be organized. 5 spirit walkers killed, 3 peace faction spirits destroyed, the integration center burning, and Nora taken hostage along with 12 others who had been present during the attack. Marcus learned about it through news coverage since his detention facility did not permit regular communication, and through the mate bond he felt Nora's terror and pain as the hostage takers beat her for refusing to denounce the integration efforts she had helped build. The bond carried her suffering directly into his awareness, and his alpha wolf went nearly feral with need to reach her, to protect her, to destroy anyone who dared harm his mate. The helplessness was worse than any torture Marcus had ever experienced, feeling through the bond every blow she took while trapped in a cell, unable to do anything except rage against circumstances that prevented him from fulfilling the most fundamental drive his alpha nature possessed. Ethan visited 6 hours after the attack, looking haggard and carrying tactical maps that suggested he had not slept since the crisis began. "Sir, I need your tactical input. We have hostage situation with heavy political implications and timeline that gives us less than 2 days before they start executing people. What would you do?" Marcus studied the maps through the red haze of alpha fury that was still screaming through his system, forcing himself to think tactically despite the mate bond carrying Nora's fear directly into his awareness. Combined wolf and spirit operation. Sergeant Kara's people can phase through walls, provide reconnaissance conventional methods cannot match. Sarah coordinates between the two groups, proves that cooperation works even under crisis conditions. But you need to move fast, because through the bond, I can feel what they're doing to Nora, and she cannot take much more. The assault happened at hour 42 of the 48-hour deadline, Sarah leading the combined team with tactical precision that made Marcus's chest swell with pride, even through the terror of knowing his daughter and his mate were both in the line of fire. He watched on news coverage with hands clenched and Wolf howling inside him, the mate bond carrying every moment of Nora's experience as the rescue unfolded. The operation took 17 minutes from breach to securing all hostages, and in those 17 minutes, Marcus aged a decade, feeling through the bond as Sarah's team reached Nora and got her to safety. 3 of the hostage takers died in the firefight, 5 wounded, the rest in custody. No hostages killed, though Nora had cracked ribs and extensive bruising from the beating she had endured. Through the mate bond, Marcus felt the exact moment when she was safe, when the immediate threat ended and she could finally process what had happened, and her first thought through the connection was not for herself, but for him. Omega concern for her alpha's well-being, overwhelming her own trauma. Sarah brought her to the detention facility that evening, despite regulations about visiting hours, and the moment Marcus saw her through the security glass, something in his chest unclenched enough to allow breathing again. She was battered and limping, but alive, and through the bond he could feel her relief at seeing him was equal to his at seeing her. "I'm fine," she said immediately, reading his alpha distress through the connection. "Cracked ribs will heal, bruises will fade. The important thing is that the hostage rescue worked, that wolves and spirits cooperated successfully under crisis conditions, and that we proved integration can function even when tested by violence. You were beaten and terrified, and I could feel every moment of it through the bond while being completely unable to reach you. That is not fine, Nora. That is the worst kind of torture an alpha can experience." She pressed her hand against the glass separating them, and Marcus mirrored the gesture from his side, the physical barrier preventing actual contact, but the mate bond carrying the intention, clearly enough. "I know. And I felt your rage and helplessness through the connection, felt your alpha instinct screaming to protect me while circumstances made that impossible. But Marcus, this is what partnership means. Sometimes one of us will be in danger, and the other will have to trust that we're strong enough to survive until help arrives. You cannot protect me from everything, and trying to undermine everything we're fighting for." The wisdom in her words did not make his wolf any less agitated, but intellectually, Marcus recognized she was right. Mate bonds were partnership, not ownership, and respecting her strength meant accepting that sometimes she would face danger he could not prevent. Over the following weeks, the hostage rescue became turning point in public opinion about integration. Senator Lockwood tried to spin it as evidence of dangerous dependence on spirits, but nobody was buying that narrative when the alternative had been dead hostages. Political establishment scrambled to respond to measurable improvements in plague cure rates and agricultural productivity, and pressure built for formal acknowledgement that Marcus's approach had been right, even if his methods violated protocol. General Kane requested meeting to discuss terms for Justice faction release, saying the successful cooperation during the crisis had convinced many of his people that partnership was possible. Marcus was temporarily released from detention under armed guard to travel to the dead zone perimeter, where spiritual containment allowed communication with the imprisoned spirits. Kane manifested more solid than Marcus had seen him before, as if the weeks of watching successful integration had strengthened him somehow. "We have been watching the integration, seeing how peace faction spirits work with wolves, observing whether partnership is genuine or just convenient alliance that will dissolve when circumstances change, and we have reached conclusions I am authorized to share." He paused, and Marcus felt the weight of judgment about to be pronounced. "We believe you are sincere. We believe most wolves, when given choice between perpetual conflict and genuine peace, will choose peace. But we also believe the structural problems that enabled Silas's crime still exist, and without fundamental changes, we will eventually face another leader who decides expedience justifies atrocity." Kane's response was detailed and specific, clearly the product of extensive deliberation about what would constitute sufficient repair. Constitutional amendments requiring spiritual representation and governance. Economic reparations to families who had suffered from plague and white attacks. Educational mandates ensuring every wolf learned true history of Operation Ashgate. And permanent limitation on alpha authority, preventing any single leader from having power to commit atrocity without oversight from multiple constituencies, including spiritual voices. These terms are reasonable and I support them completely, Marcus said. But you understand I have no authority to implement any of this. I'm convicted criminal awaiting prison transfer. We understand. But you have legitimacy that comes from being willing to sacrifice everything for what you believe is right. When you speak in favor of these changes, people listen in ways they would not listen to politicians protecting careers. We need you to be advocate, witness, voice for reconciliation, even from inside prison walls. Marcus accepted the role, knowing it meant years of advocacy from confinement, while others implemented changes he had initiated. Not the ending his career had been building toward, but the role circumstances had created, and refusing it would betray everything he had worked for. I accept, and in exchange you release the Justice faction under the terms you specified? Not all of us. There are 50 spirits too damaged by 85 years of torture to imagine trusting wolves again. We will not force them to integrate. They will remain in protective containment by their own choice, and we will guard them to ensure they do not harm themselves or others. It was bittersweet compromise, acknowledgement that some wounds were too deep to heal. But 300 minus 50 was still 250 spirits willing to try, and that was more than Marcus had dared hope for. The Justice faction's release happened 2 weeks later, carefully coordinated to avoid chaos. 250 spirits emerged from modified containment and immediately began working alongside their peace faction counterparts, bringing skills and perspectives that complemented, rather than duplicated, what was already being built. Senator Lockwood returned at the end of the 3-month deadline as promised, bringing legal authority and political pressure to shut down the integration program. But he arrived to find overwhelming public support for continuation, based on measurable improvements that spirits had facilitated. His attempt to reverse Marcus's work fell flat when confronted with parents whose children had been saved from plague and farmers whose crops were thriving for first time in decades. He left without accomplishing his goal, but made clear this was not final surrender. Political winds shift, General. Eventually people will remember why we separated from spirits in the first place. When that happens, everyone who supported this integration will pay the price. Marcus served 3 years of his sentence before being released for good behavior and based on testimony about the value of his ongoing advocacy work. During those years, he testified from confinement before congressional committees, wrote extensively about Operation Ashgate's lessons, and maintained the mate bond with Nora despite physical separation, making formal ceremony impossible. The constitutional amendments passed after 2 years of debate. Economic reparations were established through legislation Lockwood fought but could not stop. Educational mandates were implemented, ensuring each generation learned more complete history than their parents had been taught. And through it all, Nora visited regularly, their mate bond deepening from involuntary connection into genuine partnership built on shared purpose and mutual respect that transcended the circumstances that had thrown them together. When Marcus walked out of the detention facility at 45 years old, Nora was waiting with a smile that communicated welcome home without needing words. Sarah stood beside her, having risen to become director of the Spirit Integration Commission at 26 and proving herself more than capable of navigating political complexities her father had left her to manage. Welcome back, Dad. We have positions waiting at the War College if you're interested in teaching next generation about leadership and moral responsibility. And we have arrangements made for the mate bond ceremony you and Nora never got to complete because you were busy destroying your career for noble causes. The ceremony happened 3 days after his release, private gathering of the people who mattered most. Chaplain Harker officiated, Ethan and Sarah stood witness, and Sergeant Kara represented the spirits who had made reconciliation possible. It was simple compared to traditional alpha bonding ceremonies, no pack witnesses or formal challenges or elaborate ritual, just 2 people acknowledging before those they trusted that they chose partnership over solitude. Marcus spoke the traditional words with voice that carried absolute conviction. Alpha claiming Omega not through dominance, but through mutual recognition that they were stronger together than apart. Nora responded with Omega's traditional acceptance, but she modified the words in ways that honored Elena's memory while creating something new. I accept this bond freely given, partnership rather than protection, equals in service to causes larger than ourselves. And I claim you as well, Marcus Thornfield, because mate bonds are mutual or they are nothing. The modification sent ripples through those watching, because Omegas traditionally accepted alpha claims rather than making claims of their own. But the witnesses understood this was exactly the kind of partnership the integration effort was trying to model. Equal recognition, mutual choice, partnership that transcended traditional hierarchies. Through the completed bond, Marcus felt Nora's Omega energy settle into his Alpha presence in ways that made something fundamental click into place. Two halves of a whole that had been searching for each other without knowing it. And his wolf, silent and patient through 3 years of separation, finally relaxed into the certainty that his mate was safe and claimed and home. 1 year after his release, Marcus stood before a class of junior officers at the Northern War College and began his lecture the same way he began every lecture. Today we discuss Operation Ashgate and how good men become war criminals when they prioritize expedience over principle, when they follow orders without questioning moral implications, when they believe that winning justifies any means. We discuss my great-grandfather, General Silas Thornfield, his crimes and his consequences, and what those crimes cost our people for 85 years after his death. The students shifted uncomfortably as they always did, but Marcus walked them through the entire sequence with methodical precision. Silas's impossible choices, the spirit's demands, Elena's principled refusal, the decision to commit atrocity in service of victory, the generations of consequences that followed. The question you need to answer is not whether you would have done better than Silas in his situation. The question is what kind of leader you want to become, what principles you will hold even when holding them costs everything, and whether you are willing to question orders that violate your conscience even when questioning means destroying your career. After class, he walked to the memorial wall with Nora beside him. Black granite engraved with names of everyone who had died in the conflict Silas had initiated and Marcus had helped end. 129 names from his command were there alongside thousands more from 85 years of fighting. He read them aloud as he did every week, speaking each name like prayer or promise that they would not be forgotten. Nora's hand found his when he finished, Omega touch grounding him in present moment rather than endless loop of past regrets. General Kane sent message. 20 more of the 50 who remained in protective containment have chosen to attempt integration. They watched how the others were treated, saw genuine effort at partnership, and decided hope might be worth the risk. It was not dramatic victory, just 20 more damaged spirits deciding peace might be possible even for those who had been most broken. But it was enough. One more small step toward healing that would take generations to complete. The work was not finished, would never be finished in any final sense, because peace was not destination, but ongoing process of negotiation and compromise. But it was good work, meaningful work, and Marcus had made his peace with spending the rest of his life witnessing and teaching rather than commanding. The spirits walked among their descendants now, not as distant forces, but as partners. Children grew up learning to work with spiritual guides, experiencing shifts as moments of joy rather than agony, understanding their connection to forces larger than individual pack or territory. On the memorial wall, no new names had been added in 3 years, longest period without casualties from spiritual conflict since before Silas had committed his crime. It was not perfect peace, but it was peace nonetheless, built on foundation of truth rather than comfortable lies. Marcus read the final name on the wall, then turned away with Nora beside him and walked back toward the world they were still building together. Through the mate bond, he felt her contentment and her love and her absolute conviction that what they had built together was worth every sacrifice it had required. The debt had been acknowledged even if it could never be fully repaid. The truth had been told, even though it complicated narratives everyone would have preferred to keep simple. and future generations would inherit world where spirits and wolves worked together because one general had chosen principle over expedience and accepted consequences without complaint. It was enough. It had to be enough. And in the gathering evening, with Nora's hand in his and the weight of 129 names lighter than it had been, Marcus Thornfield allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it actually was END.